The alley was a slice of winter the town tried not to notice, a narrow throat between two brick fronts where the sun never learned to linger, where every breath came out in the same thin white thread, and the dust of the street turned to frost. Marian crouched beneath a sagging awning, her coat too thin, shoes wet from a drizzle that had turned to a fine, stinging sleet. Her hands, small, calloused from years of needlework, clutched a parcel of cloth. Hunger had made her hands tremble. Shame had taught her to fold them away from the eyes of anyone who passed. She had arrived 3 days earlier with a ticket and a promise. A young man at the train platform, a whispered arrangement. Silas said he would meet her in town, and there would be no shame, only a marriage that would settle debts and set things right. Instead, she had found his bench empty, his note gone with an excuse, and men with quicker hands and harder mouths who had taken more than the few coins she had left. By the second night, she slept with the taste of dust in her mouth. By the third, her legs hurt from standing at the edges of markets, waiting for a kindness that never came. When the men came, they moved with a practiced ease that turned Marian into an object of transaction. One kept his hands where they could claim a story later. The other spoke low about debts and settlements and the conveniences of law. Marian felt the old, cold thing of being measured and found wanting. She thought of her mother's sewing basket and the steady, honest work it used to finance. She thought of leaving that life, of setting out for a place she'd never known, for the hope Silas had sold her. The alley closed like a mouth. The wagon creaked into the lane like a different weather. Wheels groaned, a draft of leather and horse and wet sage rolled off it, and at the reins sat a man whose coat wore its own history, patched, brushed, salt-stiff at the collar from nights by the open. He slowed, took in the scene with eyes that did not flinch at need. He dismounted and came across the cobbles, boots sure on the slick stones, a hand steady on the seat. He did not ask for a story. He simply reached down and took Marian by the elbow. "Get up, you're going home." 4 words, not loud but exceeding anything Marian had heard in the last days. The first sound she noticed afterward was the wagon's wheel turning away from the alley, and then the smell. Warm bread, something roasted, the clean tang of sage smoke. Lucas Hart had said the words as a fact, and for a moment Marian did not understand that facts could be so kind. She did not climb easily. Hunger had hollowed her, and a bruise in her side made every step a negotiation. He steadied her without pity. He draped a coarse wool coat over her shoulders. The coat smelled faintly of horse and a man's sweat tempered by soap, and the fabric was rough against her neck, yet it was the most secure thing she had touched in 3 days. He did not press her for thanks. He asked one practical question. "Can you work?" She replied with the truth of her hands. "I sew." He nodded, as if that answered everything. The wagon smelled of the domestic life she had been taught only through memory. There was a blanket folded across a bale of hay and a loaf wrapped in cloth. Lucas offered the bread. Marian ate like a person refinding the edges of herself. The horse snuffled, and the children's voices, 2 at first, then more, met the wagon at the top of the lane, small and instant like light. They traveled back toward a ribbon of land where the town gave way to fields and a slow cluster of buildings. A house with a porch that held winter shadows, a barn, a lean-to where wood was stacked high. The sky strained thin and blue. As they neared the ranch, air smelled of pine tar and dry hay. The wagon's wheels left a white crust in their wake, a faint record of a choice that would not be easily erased. Lucas Hart did not hurry like men who were ashamed of what they had done. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned to measure his efforts to the small truths that mattered: feed the horse, mend the saddle, count the children's boots. Up close, there was a stubbornness in his mouth and a gentleness in his hands. He was a man who had kept a household and lost a wife to fever some seasons past. His face held the line of a man who had learned how to hold grief in one place and duty in another. At the threshold of the kitchen, tea hissed in a chipped kettle. The room was small but honest, sun through a window that wore the past week's frost in little filigreed patterns, jars of pickles and fruit lined on a shelf, a loaf cooling on a board, the air heavy with the yeasty note of bread and the soft scent of mending oil. Rose, the eldest of the children, met Marian with an exact, unguarded curiosity. She was a girl of maybe 8, with a scattering of freckles and a methodical way of studying people as if they were patterns to be understood. Evan and Miles, boys who could not keep still, hovered at the doorway, cheeks candy bright from the cold. Caleb, the smallest, clung to his mother's skirts now and then, even though he had quickly taken to the quiet order of the place. Lucas did not make a show. He spoke plainly. "There's work here," he said. "We need someone who can sew and keep the house. We'll pay you in room and board, and give you the chance to earn coins for yourself. You won't be given what you don't want, and you won't be expected to do things that dishonor you." His phrasing was careful. He did not offer charity as absolution. He set a line between help and purchase. Marian found herself answering as if she had rehearsed it her whole life. "I'll work, I can cook, I can mend, I know how to keep a house." "You'll be paid," he said, and in the saying he made an unadorned promise that mattered more than any oath in the courtrooms of the town. A place to sleep, hands to steady, a family to help. They did not call it a home at first. It took days for the name to settle into walls. At first, it was a place where Marian had shelter, an upstairs room with a thin mattress, and a window that watched the stars like pinpricks of cold. It took longer for her laughter to arrive in the household. She found it in slow ways. The crackle of the hearth when she tossed on a split of dry wood, the richness of broth after the first full loaf she baked, the way the children came to her for small repairs. A frayed cuff, a torn patch, the need to have someone listen to a scraped knee. She taught Rose to take a seam at the hem so it would not pucker. She sat with Miles while they tied small dolls together with yarn. She coaxed the shyest notes from Caleb's little mouth until he hummed at night, a soft wind through the house. Lucas watched without claiming a reward. He gave instructions, how the stove worked, where the jars of preserves were kept, which cupboards held flour, and then allowed Marian the liberty of making those things her own. He expected labor and rewarded it with fairness. He supervised wood stacking with a practical precision and allowed the children to learn under his eye. He taught Evan how to check the horse's shoes. He showed Rose how to carry a pan without slopping the stew. Winter hangs long in a man's thoughts when you live on the land. Lucas spoke of it in a manner that never aimed to frighten, but insisted on planning. "We need to look at the stack," he said one evening, as frost edged the window panes. "If that winter don't have mercy this year, we'll be glad for a full cord. We'll can what we can. It ain't romance, it's work. But if you're willing, we'll see the lamps through." Marian learned quickly the value of small, steady things. She learned to tie knots in the cord that bound firewood so it would not slip in the wagon. She learned where to bring the jars for the root cellar to keep from freezing. The smell of sage smoke in the morning became a hymn she could hum while mending. Bread, when it came from her oven warm and brown, was a kind of benediction. Hands that had once trembled with hunger now passed a loaf across a table to a child who smiled like a bell. The work did more than feed bodies. It provided an economy of dignity. When Marian stitched a collar neatly, a look passed between her and Rose that required no words. When she salted beet preserves into the jars and wiped the rims clean, her hands were doing what they had always been intended to do, not as evidence of need, but as proof of capacity. Yet the town is never far from what it imagines for what arrives there. Word travels on a current of suspicion and calculation, as surely as it does on a wagon's rumble. Some afternoons Moores could be seen in the general store, leaning against the counter as if the room belonged to his shadow. He was an agent of sorts, someone who worked the edges of promises and obligations, a man whose business was in making others' misfortunes into his gain. His suit never sat quite right on the bones of him, and his smile always carried a ledger beneath it. Tommy Vickers was another sort of wind. He swaggered through town like a man with a right to other people's lives. He was loose with talk of settlement and exchange. Rumor said he had a patience for coercion and a tendency to see people as negotiable. He liked to joke loudly, the way men do when they want to test where the line of decent society stands and whether it will hold. They found out about Marian because the town finds out about anything that is new and unaccounted for. Some recognized her as the woman who had arrived with a ticket and no husband. Others remembered the sight of a wagon leaving the alley. Some even offered a blessing in their softness, a few a side-eye and a judgment. Moore's ears pricked at the potential, Tommy's at the possibility. The first time Moores came to the ranch, it was under a civility practiced by men who traded favors. He arrived with the creak of business in his voice. "That girl," he said before he had reached the porch. "There's a matter of obligation. Agencies don't like loose ends. I represent interests that would prefer such things concluded. Lucas met him in the kitchen with a bowl in his hands. He did not rise to show offense. He had a way of letting a man reveal himself and then drawing the perimeter. "You did not come for bread, Mr. Morse," Lucas said. "If there's something lawful, take it to the sheriff. If there's anything else, leave." Morse smiled as if with a blade hidden behind his teeth. "You run a tidy place, Mr. Hart. Makes a man wonder who owns whom." He let the question hang as currency. Lucas put the bowl down. He wiped his hands on a towel, his face ordinary and set. "This place is mine," he said simply. "Those children answer to me. The work here is honest and paid. If you have business, you take it to a judge." It was a declaration that cost nothing and yet made something clear. Morse, who trafficked in grey shadows, left with a cough and an over-polished sympathy. He had not expected opposition wrapped in the domestic cadence of a kitchen. He had expected either solitude or fear. Tommy Vickers was more forward when he came. He appeared on horseback at the far gate with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He spoke to the boys like a man testing the edges of property. "Someone told me there's a new woman in the house," he said, voice low. "Fine hands on a needle are useful for a man who knows how to keep a house." Lucas watched him approach, the line of his jaw like the rail of a fence. "You'll find no bargaining here," Lucas replied. "You walk off my land." Tommy drew himself up and spat on the ground with the bored viciousness of a man accustomed to getting his way. "We'll see what the law says when a matter comes up. Agencies have claims. People sign things sometimes when they're desperate." He let the implication hang, heavy and thudding as a hammer. Lucas did not reply with threats. He said, "If any man wants to bring a lawful complaint, we'll see him in front of the sheriff. You won't take a woman or a child from this place while I have anything to say about it?" Tommy laughed, a sound meant to unsettle. He left with the kind of promise that meant he'd come back to test the firmness of a fence. The boys watched him go, and Rose clung a little closer to Marian when the gate creaked shut. Threats are not always physical first. They arrive as the accumulation of questions in a town. Who pays for what? Who owes whom what? Who is useful and who is waste? Morse and Tommy represented two vectors of pressure, the lawful-looking menace dressed in paper and signatures, and the blunt human appetite masked as joviality. Both could rend a fragile bedrock of safety if left to their devices. Lucas knew that. He also knew the calendar. The seasons had their rhythms. The first overnight frost had skinned the ground in a silvery sheen and left the children running their fingers along the windows, watching breath fog like miniature ghosts. He set about inventory with an economy that bordered on ritual. He climbed the lean-to with a rope and a lantern, checked the cords of wood stacked against the east wall, and measured out what would be needed the way a man accounts for life. "You can't put off the cold," he told Marian one evening, as they sat mending a sleeve by lamplight. The lamps in the house threw round halos on the table. Outside, a wind fretted the porch eaves. "If we wait until night, we'll be hauling frozen logs. We do a little each day and it's done. Miss Cross, if we're full up on a cord or two, then 3 days of storm don't have to mean hunger." She listened and found in his words not condescension but a fact of survival. She had seen cold take things before. Barn roofs collapsed under the weight of a season, a neck stiffen with fever after a night too long on the ground. The thought of the children, small and trusting, sleeping with a thin blanket against a sky that could turn blue and relentless, made her hands move with renewed purpose. She learned to can peaches with a stubborn focus, sealing the jars and arranging them in the cool dark of the cellar. She learned to sort through grain and sickle out the weevils. Her hands moved like a woman casting a net around the life she now shared. In the evenings, when the chores were done and the house settled into the comforting small noises of people who did not need to shout to be heard, a fork clinking, a shoe set down on the mat, a child's small cough, Lucas would sit and speak rarely. He was a man of few speeches and many reckonings. Once, over the steady hiss of the stove, he said, "If a thing comes for us, if someone thinks he can take what we've built, you tell me. I'll go to the law if I have to. I'm not saying I'll start a fight. I'm saying I'll meet whatever's lawful with what is right." Marian believed him because she had already seen him act. He had taken a woman from an alley and wrapped a coat around her. He had steadied an argument with a ledger man and a swaggering bully with nothing but the bluntness of a man who knew his responsibilities. His choices had an immediacy that felt like shelter, practical, unromantic, and decisive. If the deep freeze came, if the town's edges had predators ready to turn flesh into currency, his decision to bring her into the house had already redirected several possible deaths into a household that could stand. But small towns also breed gossip like mold and business like mineshafts. Letters go where men like Moors direct them. A notice could be drawn up, a claim filed by an agent who specialized in finding the loose ends of desperation and winding them up for profit. People read the notices and filed them into their own private ledgers of how to behave. The sheriff's attention could be drawn by such a paper, and then a line of men might gather to see justice or its imitation carried out. So when a thin envelope arrived one afternoon, pushed under the door by a man in a stiff collar, it was no surprise that Lucas unfolded it with a slow hand and read aloud. Marian and Rose paused in their mending. Evan halted mid-swing with a piece of scrap lumber. Miles kept his mouth open with a question half-formed. It was the kind of paper Moors produced, artful in its civility, legal where it needed to be, and venomous in its implications. It spoke of obligations kept and claims owed, of a woman who had arrived in the town without proper settlement of certain contracts. It requested, with the softest of steel, that the sheriff forthwith identify the woman in question and produce her for a hearing to determine the validity of a representation. Lucas folded the paper with the same care he used on his leather repairs. He looked at Marian and the children as if marking the pieces of a map. "He wants a hearing," he said. "He expects the sheriff to do his part. We'll expect the law to do its." Marian felt the old tightness in her throat, the one that had come in the alley. It wanted to tell her she was back at the edge, that the work she had done would evaporate like steam. But there was something else beside the tightness now. A stack of wood tied, a cellar of sealed jars, a stove that kept the house at a small fierce heat. There were hands, her own and Lucas's and the children's, knowing how to keep things done. There was a man who had offered to meet the law with what was right. Lucas kept his face level and practical. "We'll go to the hearing," he said. "We'll take what we have. If he has papers and proof, we'll see them. If he has men who think they have the right to carry her off, they'll have to answer to the sheriff." "You'll come?" Marian asked, because her voice still learned how to ask where trust could be placed without being foolish. He nodded. "I'll be there. And if they come to explore the yard with hands that oughtn't to touch another man's fence, we have the sheriff and the law and friends. We have wood stacked and food put away. There's work that saves people more surely than words." Outside, the light paled faster. The children ran a quick game, stamping frost out of their boots. The rooster in the yard gave a singular suspicious cry, and then fell silent. There was time enough to do the hauling, to set the jars, to mend the hem on a coat that might be needed in the early dark. The house hummed with the activity of people who had something at stake and knew the meaning of being prepared. That night, Rose, tucked a patch into a sleeve with careful fingers, humming a small tune she'd learned from Marian. The lamplight made a warm halo on the table where crusts of bread cooled. Lucas stood at the doorway, where the porch met the cold, looking out toward the road as if measuring the nearness of possible trouble. He turned, and with the brevity of a man who did not waste words, said, "We stand together. That's the thing that matters." Marian went upstairs to her narrow bed and lay awake, listening to the house breathe. The wind found its way around eaves and through cracked panes, a violin's low note. She thought of the alley and its cold, of the men who had taken advantage of a moment, and of a man who had chosen 4 words that altered the map of her life. She thought of the smell of sage and bread, and the small cluster of jars in the cellar. She folded those images like blankets around the fear in her chest. Sleep came slow as a tide. When it finally took her, it was with the conviction that the choice made for her by another had been more than rescue. It had been a reordering. Lucas's 4 words had not simply moved her from alley to wagon. They had placed her inside a sequence of practical acts, stacking wood, teaching children, keeping a ledger, that would be the true bulwark against what the winter could do. If the cold turned deadly, it would be because one could not get a cord of wood or a jar of stew or a roof to hold against the night. His decision had bought them time and resources. It had, in the smallest arithmetic, created chances where there had been none. Dawn came with a frost that painted every blade of grass silver. The day held its own liturgy of work. Lucas and the boys hauled a new pile of wood from the back lot. Marian filled the pantry shelves. Rose and Evan scrubbed the windows so light could come in clean. The motions were not heroic in an epic sense, they were the quiet, habitual deeds that accumulate into survival. Each log set square, each jar sealed, each stitch mended was a small act against the winter's pressure. Word of the notice moved as well. Moore's presence in town was like a shadow that lengthened with intention. He spoke to the sheriff with the soft, particular voice of a man who knew how to arrange paper to look like necessity. He wrote his claims with a practiced hand. He threaded Tommy into his designs like a needle threading another's intent into a cloth. On the third day after the notice arrived, Tommy came by the road and stopped the boys as they were bringing in a wheelbarrow of kindling. His tone was playful, the way a man plays with fire to see who will flinch. "Seems you've taken in someone without much of a past," he said. "You know how the law can be when someone has overlooked something." Evan's jaw clenched. Lucas's hand on the axe handle did not change, but there was a stillness to him, a kind of pressure that told men like Tommy they were out of place. "This is our place," Lucas said again. "You want to make a claim? See the sheriff." Tommy spat. "We'll see the sheriff," he said, and the promise sat between them like a dry plank. But he rode off within the hour, a man who intended to come back measured not by courage but by the arithmetic of opportunity. Not everything that threatened was outside the fence. Moore's had friends in the town who found him useful, and some of those friends were the sort who could fill a courtroom bench with murmur and weight. Lucas knew that they could not rely on the community to refuse a man like Moore's outright. Too many had small debts or ambitions that made them eager to see a claim settled. So he did the practical things. He wrote a list of witnesses. He asked the children to remember faces and times and small certainties that could be sworn to. He drew up records of pay he offered Marian, and he set down in a ledger the jars and bushels that would stand as evidence of provision. He made sure there were receipts for coin paid. He was building not a fortress of words, but a scaffolding of facts. Marian watched this with a new kind of seeing. She had been rescued, yes, but now she was part of a work that had to be defended. She did not shrink from that responsibility. She signed her name when asked, and she learned to keep the accounts in a neat hand. She stitched sleeves by lamplight and wrote down the number of loaves baked each week. The act of recording felt like a prayer, each line a plea that the future would be spared needless hardship. One evening, as the sky bruised and the first flurries began to dot the road, Lucas stood with Marian on the porch and looked out over the yard where the children raced each other with a small, reckless joy. The snow came light, at first like flowers sifted through a tired child's hand, then heavier, like a thought consolidating into fact. "We do what we can," he said. "We keep what we've got. If men come with claims and papers, they'll have to produce them. They'll have to prove their rights. Until then, we set our house in order." There was a steadiness to his voice that felt like a hinge. For Marian, the hinge turned slowly. She had been brought from the cold into a place where decisions were made not only in the heat of rescue, but in the ledgered patience of preparation. The winter that would prove the true cost of each choice was on its way. Men like Moore's and Tommy would test the limits of law and reputation. The danger they posed was not only to a single woman's autonomy, but to the children's small, vulnerable lives when wind and night pressed together. The first snow fell thick enough to hush the yard. Lanterns glowed like islands in an evening sea. Inside, the family gathered close to the table where bread had been broken and stew ladled into bowls. They laughed, a little sharper because of the cold that waited, but it was real. Outside in town, the machinery of Moore's claim turned, and small notices were called for in the courthouse. Lucas read the papers with a hand that did not tremble. He copied names into his book and turned them into witnesses. If the next steps would be in a room full of strangers, if the matter would be decided by a clerk's pen and a judge's bench, then the weight of the coming days would be carried by this accumulation of small preparedness, wood stacked, jars sealed, witnesses willing to say what they had seen. These were the things that saved lives in winter. When the sheriff finally came to the porch with a polite civic air and a citation tucked into his hand, the house did not flinch. The men of law and order had roles to perform, and Lucas met his with the quiet resolve of someone who knew that a life is held together by the sum of small choices. He invited the sheriff to sit and warmed a cup of tea. Marian stood by the hearth and felt the moment prick like a cold point on the skin. She did not feel fragile. She felt like someone whose life had been reordered by the deliberate kindness of a stranger and the steady decision of a man who chose to make his house a shelter, not a bargain. The sheriff explained the hearing in scraped official terms. Moores had filed a complaint, named witnesses, claimed an obligation. It was within the law, he said, to require that a woman in question be presented before the court to examine the claims. Marian listened as if learning a new stitch. The terms were dry, but beneath them ran a current that threatened to undo the careful work they had already done. Lucas folded his hands. He said nothing snide or big. He simply asked for the time and the place and the list of claims. He would be there. Marian would be there. The children would be with neighbors that evening, because Lucas did not intend to expose them to the glare of a courtroom any more than necessity required. When the sheriff left and the door swung closed, the house breathed again. The wind rose and the first real snowfall began, thick and steady, taking down the last of autumn's leaves and knitting the world into a whiteness that was both beautiful and indifferent. At the kitchen table they lit candles and ate in that slow, deliberate way of people who know how work has a habit of creating solidarity. Late that night, Marian sat by the window and watched snow accumulate on the sill. Her fingers toyed with a needle case as she thought about the hearing, about Moores's letter, about Tommy's easy threats. She had been moved by the man who took her from the alley, but she had also been set in motion. She had become a person who could be summoned as evidence of something larger. The thought frightened her and steadied her both. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a bell tolled the hour. The cold was coming down. It would not be kind. Someone had to be ready. Someone had to make the decision, again and again, to keep the stove burning, to haul the wood, to seal the jars. Lucas had made a decision when he had said those 4 quiet words in the alley. But decisions are like seeds. They need tending before they bear the fruit of safety. In the hush before sleep, Marian felt the shape of their days as if they were stitches in a long seam. The winter would test them. The town's appetite for tidy settlements would test them. Men like Moores and Tommy would try to bend law and will to their own ends. Yet there, within the small circuit of hearth and table, a series of practical acts gathered like allies. The stacked wood, the ledgered receipts, the witnesses prepared to speak, the children taught to care for themselves and others. Outside, the snow fell heavier, and the world narrowed to the warm glow of the window. Inside, someone laughed softly at a remembered joke, and a child called for more stew. Marian closed her eyes and thought of the alley. She had been plucked from that edge by a man whose choice had been simple and decisive. She thought of the winter to come and felt, for the first time in days, that she might meet it not as prey, but as a part of a household that would answer to its own. There would be a hearing. There would be questions in a room of men who preferred paper to people. There would be choices to make and lines to stand behind. Lucas had chosen already. He had taken her in, provided shelter, and begun the work of making them ready for the cold that would make or break many lives. The snow kept falling, layering itself on the fence posts and the stacked wood. Each flake was small and quiet, but together they made a weight that would reveal the weak places. The work they had done so far made the weak places less likely to fail. When the dawn came gray and compact, the sheriff's horse stamped impatiently by the gate. The notice had reached the courthouse. Moores's voice was already making its civil rounds. Lucas tightened his scarf and checked the children's boots. Marian buttoned her coat and met his eye. There was a resolve there that had nothing to do with law books and everything to do with love in the ordinary sense. The decision to stay and to fight, to prepare and to protect. It was the kind of decision that, if made in time, did not feel heroic. It felt necessary. They would go to the hearing. They would take the facts they had gathered. They would call their witnesses. And if the town tried to turn a winter of need into an opportunity for greed, the house would answer not with threats, but with the meticulous clarity of evidence and the stubborn, readable pattern of people who had learned to keep each other safe. The cold was on its way. The choice Lucas had made would be tested, but not yet broken. As the team hitched the wagon and the children were set in place with blankets and flurries caught in their hair, Marian felt something settle in her chest that was not fear. It was a small, steady ember, a thing that could be fed. She rose to the task alongside them. The alley was behind her. The porch and the jars and the ledger lay ahead. When the wagon rolled toward town again, the tracks it left were not merely marks behind a vehicle. They were a record of an action that had begun to alter the future. A woman pulled from the brink, A man choosing to make his house a refuge, and the beginning of a defense that would, if the winter pressed hard and the town's appetites were cruel, be the difference between survival and something else. The snow fell harder and the world contracted to the narrow road. The decision had been made. The rest would be work. They rode back through a town that had not yet learned to be kind to surprises. The courthouse sat like a patient stone, windows dark against the falling snow, and the wagon's wheels left seams of wet that stiffened into ruts. Marian wrapped her hands around her coat and watched the world narrow to the measured rhythm of horses' steps. She felt the weight of the ledger in Lucas's satchel beside her, the receipts and notes, the list of witnesses written in his careful slanting hand. It was not poetry, it was the arithmetic of defense. If this kind of rescue moves you, press like and tell us where you're watching from. They entered a room that smelled faintly of dust and ink, its benches set for a ritual everyone there pretended to think was simple. The judge's bench sat elevated, a low domed lamp above casting a warm pool that did little to cut the room's chill. People arranged themselves in clusters, neighbors who had the habit of forming a shore around anyone who seemed likely to be pushed out to sea. Moores arrived with a patient civility as if he were going to measure grain. Tommy Vickers came with a grin that had the elasticity of a man who assumed a county would prefer his convenience to anyone's dignity. Marian felt the room tighten like a sleeve at the throat. The sheriff read the complaint aloud, a voice balanced between duty and the boredom of regular paperwork. Moores, with a smoothness rehearsed from many such declarations, explained his claims as if he were consulting a ledger rather than a human life. There were obligations, he said, signed by parties in a moment of need. Our interest is to see those obligations recognized. Lucas listened, and then set his own pack on a bench. He opened it and laid out the quiet things that would matter most in a room of paper. Receipts for coin paid to Marian, a note of weeks she had worked, the jars and the cord of wood counted and witnessed by the neighbors. He called James Thornton and Sheriff Morrison as witnesses. James spoke plainly of the days he had seen Marian at the house, how she had risen before dawn to bake, how she mended and salted. Sheriff Morrison confirmed that no prior document had any bearing on the land Lucas cultivated, and that the claim as presented by Moores did not on its face show any enforceable transfer of a person as property. Moores smiled and produced a roll of paper. His voice slipped into the hazards of formality, definitions that meandered from the human scale. He read from letters and contracts, words like settlement and representation, floating like small cold birds that wanted to make their shape into law. He had witnesses who would speak of arrangements, men with ink and memory, who would insist that contracts had been struck. Tommy, when called to the stand by way of a man who loved to watch people sweat, offered testimony more of implication than of fact. He spoke of men who favored expedients, of times when a woman in need might sign to be spared worse. His voice was a tide that sought to erode what had been built on the ranch, one lazy sentence at a time. The room hummed in the particular way of small towns when important talk is also gossip given robes. Lucas rose and did not offer speeches. He offered what he had. The ledger with its receipts, the list of neighbors who could attest to Marian's presence and her labors, the records of coin exchanged, and the counts of jars and wood. He called Rose to the stand, a small figure steady in a grown-up way that made people blink. Rose spoke without drama, about mending, about bread and the stove, and how Marian had taught her to sew a hem so it would lie flat. Her words landed blunt and honest. Evan and Miles were kept from the bench. Their testimony would have been small and messy and true, but Lucas preferred to shield their childhood from the theater. He chose instead James Thornton and the sheriff, men with the authority to show the pattern of practical life at the ranch. The judge, Judge Morrison, older than most and less easily impressed, listened with a tilt of concern in his eyes. He asked Moores to clarify his documents. He raised questions that made the agent shift from the comfort of paper to the discomfort of particulars. "Mr. Morse," the judge said, "your complaint asks a tribunal to treat a person as if she were a sum in a ledger. I require to be shown, in plain terms, where the consent was given and under what law you seek to enforce it." Morse faltered, the smile thinning. He proffered a contract that read like a promise signed under duress. Lines that could be read as convenience or as coercion depending on which hand turned the page. When the judge asked if there had been witnesses at the signing, Moore's answer grew flustered. The ink spoke of a quiet, unobserved moment. The room listened for the thudding sound of consequence. Lucas's case was not an oratory. It was a slow unveiling of practice. He showed receipts, dates, the small domestic details that travel badly in a man's memory, but well in a woman's ledger. He laid out the jars and the cord, and called neighbors who testified to the work they had seen. He showed the ledger of pay he had given Marian, and he did not ask for pity, but for law to be law. The judge, with the authority of someone who had sat through his share of men, wanting the court to transform their appetite into right, weighed paper against practice. There is a particular hush when a judge reaches toward a decision that will tip more than one life. Marian felt it as a pressure, like the stillness before a blizzard arrives. She had prepared herself in the small ways she knew to prepare, sewing up her story in neat stitches, learning to read the law's language as one learns a recipe. And still the outcome had a random human edge. Judge Morrison spoke slowly. He acknowledged that the documents Moores presented were not harmless in their appearance, and that agencies like his were not unknown to this court. But he also asked for clarity on whether the documents presented amounted to an enforceable transfer of a person without consent. He noted the testimony of witnesses who had seen Marian in undoubted labor at the ranch, earning coin, sleeping under the roof Lucas provided. He asked whether the sheriff had reason to believe the papers showed a lawful claim. The sheriff, who had balanced paperwork against faces for longer than most, said plainly that he had found no prior sworn instrument that would lawfully compel a woman to be removed from a household under these circumstances. In his ruling, Judge Morrison did not indulge in moralizing. He spoke as a judge must, on the basis of what the law as written and the facts as presented allowed. He denied the immediate writ that Moores had sought to compel the sheriff to remove Marian. He ordered that Moore's agency be referred to a higher inquiry if there were grounds to suspect the documents were procured under dubious circumstances. He pronounced that until such inquiry could be made and cause shown, Marian would remain where she was, and any forcible removal would be met with the court's disfavor and legal consequence. The decision landed not as triumph, but as permission. The law had recognized that there was not enough lawful cause to unwind what the ranch had already formed. People left in a murmur. Some clapped. Neighbors who had kept respect for a household's quiet industry. Others watched with the kind of neutrality that is the town's way of saying, "I see you, but I keep my ledges." Moores left holding his papers with a face that had lost a small color of certainty. Tommy's smirk thinned into something less audacious. The sheriff stood up to make sure the ruling was carried out. He would not be called to enforce an order that had not been made. Lucas, without theatrics, lifted Marian's hand in a small human gesture, an acknowledgement more private than any public claim. Marian felt the air in the room move back into ordinary space, where people mend what they can and take for granted the work of doing so. They returned to the ranch with the rain beginning and the first gusts of the real winter harrying the porch. There was a sense of fragile security, a day better than the last but not free of perils. The judge's ruling bought them breathing room, time to stack the wood higher, to seal the jars, to tighten accounts. The work they had done, which had seemed at times merely chores, now showed itself as a shield. Lucas's decision to take in a woman from an alley had translated into a literal store of survival. The town did not forget. Laws are slow, but resentments are quick. Moore's business could reroute through other hands, and men like Tommy did not easily accept public setbacks. For all that the courthouse had spoken, men who had appetite for advantage sometimes chose a different avenue: muscle, intimidation, and later, vengeance. On a night when the sky was a low press of iron, the clatter of hooves came like a punctuation through the hush. The moon was a slice behind cloud, and the porch light burned low. Marian had been sewing near the stove, the needle flashing in a small, steady motion. The children were bedded, thin blankets tucked tight, their breath a soft chorus of small exhalations. Lucas was in the barn checking the last of the harnesses, counting what still needed mending before a storm locked them down. Tommy returned with company. Men do not always operate at noon, when they mean to take what is not freely given. They came after dark, 3 figures maneuvering in the grey, their boots smearing wet into the yard. They thought themselves owed. They had the confidence of those who assume the law's recent chastening was merely a stumble. They approached the gate with a sinuous disrespect, voices low and meant to be convincing. Tommy himself swaggered, his grin varnished by the cold. "Come out, Hart," he called, the name intended to bait. "There's talk to be had. We can settle this without fuss." Lucas came to the door with his lantern, the light painting his face in an honest, unadorned way. There was no swagger in his posture, no triumph. He stood like a hinge. "You can speak here," he said, "or you can ride on back to town." Tommy chuckled, and then stepped within the porch's pale reach, a man trying to make his size mean authority. He reached out as if to touch a shoulder or a sleeve, a tiny probing imposition that pretended to be manly camaraderie. It was a gauge of how much a man dared between two fences. Marian, who had been drawn to the doorway by the sound, saw the shape of a problem made small and then large. She felt something in her that was not only fear. She felt the habit of work, of protecting what one had gathered through the day, and an instinct to act. In the sitting room there was a rifle hung over the mantel for the odd coyote or for the necessity of protecting the herd. It was not a decoration, it was a tool as honest as the axe. Lucas's hand rested briefly on the stock when he met Tommy's eyes. Tommy's companion, emboldened by his leader's surety, reached for a pocket. It was the kind of motion that men with intent do, the hand seeking a tool to bully with. Lucas moved with the broad economy of someone who had practiced necessary things. He stepped forward and said, "We do not talk with hands that want to steal." The moment narrowed. Men who live by intimidation often rely on surprise and the idea that a household will fold. But the house had been made into something different. A small community with a ledger and witnesses and stout wood stacked against the cold. That evening, it also had a determined woman who would not be pulled back into the stove's dangerous margin. Tommy's hand was halfway out when a single sharp sound cut the air. It was not a shot aimed to kill, but a warning fired into the dark, a deliberate bark that made men's knees carry a new tremor. Marian, standing in the doorway with the rifle steady in a hand that had learned precision from sewing, had fired the barrel once into the field beyond the fence. The report made the dogs wake and the men flinch. "Back off," she said, her voice a narrow, strong thing. The words landed with a force born from protection rather than hatred. She did not look malice into Tommy's face. She looked at the gap between his intent and the law. The sound had done what a good blaze does. It marked boundary. Tommy swore and took a step back. The bravado briefly peeled to reveal a man aware that the theater had shifted. He spat and cursed, but he had misread the house for a soft thing. The sheriff, who had been tipped by a neighbor who had heard the men come, rode up with 2 deputies, their boots stabbing the yard with urgency. The posse moved with the economy of men who understood the difference between law and mob. There was no great brawl. Tommy was taken in the quiet way the law likes. Hands behind his back, a muttered claim of insult, and the clink of irons that for a while replaced his grin with the more honest pallor of consequence. The deputies led him away. The men who had come with him dissolved like a bad weather, making for the road and the shelter of the town's lights. The children came to the doorway, eyes wide as if they had found magic in the way their world had kept its edges. Rose, who had watched grown men with more understanding than her years should allow, held Marian's sleeve and let the steadiness of her hand rest on the woman's forearm. "You scared them," she whispered, as if it were a secret worth savoring. "You did what needed to be done," Lucas said, not loud but full of exact pride. He took the rifle from Marian as one man passes a tool to another for safekeeping, and then he set it gently back upon its hook. There was no triumphalism in the act, only a recognition that, in a house that feeds itself by work, defense sometimes arrives as necessity. They sat that night with the window shut to the world and the fire made high. The children slept quicker after a bowl of warmed milk and sweetened bread. Outside the wind sharpened and the snow began to come in earnest, the world narrowing again to the ring of the roof and the light. In the morning the tracks of the men who had come were visible, a smudged record across the yard, but inside there were jars and stacked wood and children who were warm. Winter did its blunt work. There were days of white where the horizon vanished, where the sky and the land became a single indifferent sheet. Roads closed and the town narrowed to the essential. The pantry mattered as a measure of possibility. The cord of wood measured in months. Each preserved jar felt like a small miracle of discipline. Marian moved among these necessities with a quiet competence. She taught Rose how to take a stew and stretch it by adding dried beans and root vegetables. She mended boots with a process that made them hold their soles like new oaths. She kept the root cellar's temperature with the care of someone who had been entrusted with small laws of survival. Lucas, who had been judged in the courthouse and tested by men at the gate, spent his days doing what a farmer does, tending animals, fixing fences, counting the weather's debts. He also kept an eye on the ledger and on the town, for Moores did not seem a man inclined to pleasant retirement. School children who had been neighborly brought in a basket now and then, a crust, some preserves, the small economies of a community that decides to shelter one another. James Thornton would appear with a load of wood when he could spare it, and neighbors who had been remote offered removable kindnesses that stacked into safety. The sheriff's presence was not a parade, but a mutual understanding that law and community could be a cushion. The days lengthened into a tighter rhythm. One bitter night, a storm slammed across the prairie, and the wind threw itself at the house with a force that made shutters rattle like bones. The stew simmers, and the children huddled under blankets as the family, by no other name than the work they did, kept watch. When dawn came, it left them a small wonder. The fence bowed beneath the weight but had not broken. The roof kept its snow without collapse. The jars in the cellar had kept their seals. There was no occasion for triumph. There was only relief, a practice of gratitude that smelled of toasted bread and tea. Months passed, and the court's preliminary inquiry into Moores's agency yielded more complaints than shock. The judge's order had not been an end so much as a beginning. Folks in town began to talk about the business model of picking up the desperate and converting them into liabilities that served an agent's ledger. There were hearings, witnesses, and a slow unspooling of paperwork. Moores found himself called to explain, his smoothness less effective when cross-examined by men who had lived longer by muscle than by paper. The court's attention moved beyond the single matter and toward the possibility of systemic abuse. Tommy's punishment was not dramatic but instructive. He received a fine and a short holding that stripped him of some of the swagger he had relied on. The sheriff placed conditions on his future proximity to the ranch. It was not justice in a grand sense, but it was consequence that mattered. A man once used to treating a house as a negotiation learned to count the price of his intention. The town watched with that half-relief that comes when a neighbor is held to account. Marian, who had arrived as an anonymous traveler, found her name crossing from stranger to kin. She signed a small paper that formalized an agreement of employment and protection. It was a measly legal thing by big standards, but in a winter on the prairie, small things are the correct miracles. The judge's injunction and the sheriff's willingness to enforce it had given them the breathing room to transform vulnerability into something durable. The cords of wood, the jars, the children's warm clothes, all of these were the practical instruments of survival. Lucas's decision had created the conditions in which they could be assembled. Time, that slow mender of edges, began to work its soft changes. Marian's hands left their mark not only on seams, but on the daily life of the house. She and Lucas developed a rhythm, an economy of tasks that fit the shape of two people who had learned to trust each other's competence. They did not speak of heroism, they spoke of labors and the rightness of them. The children took to Marian as to someone who kept their days balanced, and she, in return, found space to lay down soft attachments that were no less real for being ordinary. One late afternoon, when the sky was the color of ledger paper and the light slanted like a promise, Lucas took Marian out to the side of the barn. The snow had eased into a thin, brittle crust, and the children were inside by the stove, knotting yarn and listening to Rose read aloud. Lucas had sewn a patch into a jacket in the quiet hours and then returned it to its owner with a small private ceremony. He stood with his hands in his pockets as if to hold nothing, and then he reached out and took Marian's fingers with the tender bluntness of a man who loved in work. "I don't give you silk words," he said, his voice low. "I give you a stove that keeps steady, a roof that will not leak, a ledger that has your name on it. I give you days I will not waste. If you'll have me, I'll have you, not because of pity, not because of mercy only, but because I choose it." Marian, whose life had been a procession of promises made and broken, let the words settle. There was no flourish, no grand speech, only the reality of two lives that had become entwined in the rhythmic tasks of winter and the stern business of keeping a small household alive. She placed her hand over his and said a simple thing, "I will." They were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse at dawn. A morning ringed with frost and the hush of people who had come because they had seen what had been done and wanted to stand with it. Judge Morrison presided, and the children, Rose, Evan, Miles, and small Caleb, sat as if at a table in a hall where they had been given a permanent place. The vows were short and honest, words that exchanged promises of care rather than extravagant declarations. Marian sealed her name onto papers not merely as ceremonial ink, but as a legal fact. She now belonged to a family as both member and worker, with rights and protections that had been scarce that year for someone who had once been bargaining currency. In the months that followed, the threat from the town waned into the shape of stories told at a distance. Moore's agency lost a good deal of its leverage after inquiries sifted through its practices, and men who made livelihoods from the vulnerable found fewer clients willing to be handled like goods. Tommy stayed on the outskirts as a cautionary tale, a man who had learned that a house's walls could have more weight than the swagger of a bully. The house kept its own calendar. Spring arrived with the stubborn, damp patience of land that had been bedded by a long cold. The children ran in the thaw like small people newly discovered. Jars were opened, and the taste of preserved peaches was sweeter because of all the labors that had gone into saving them. The hearth now had 2 people who governed its blaze, and the ledger on Lucas's shelf had Marian's handwriting in the margins, a neatness that marked a life taken in hand. Marian's transformation was not sudden. It was a filial accumulation. She had salvaged not only her own future, but a small family's season of warmth. Her name in the ledger, the signatures in court, the jars in the cellar, these were the arithmetic by which survival was measured. Lucas's decision to say, "Get up, you're going home," had become a cascade of practical acts. Shelter, work, legal defense, preparation for the cold, and the willingness to stand up in a courtroom and in a doorway. Those acts, woven together, were a net. Years later, when they told the story by the fire to a neighbor's child who had come for a visit, they did not dramatize it. Marian would describe the alley as a place of thin air and thinner kindness, and she would say how 4 words had been the hinge. Lucas would add that a coat and a loaf of bread do not change the world alone, that it is the long work of stacking wood and sealing jars and keeping promises that makes a family steady. The children, who had once been small and dependent, spoke with the lazy confidence of people who knew the warmth of a house and the taste of bread that had been earned. When the cold turned deadly in that first winter, it was a test not of miracles but of readiness. Had Marian been taken or driven away, the children would have been left with too few jars and less wood than a long storm required. A household split in the face of a blizzard is a hazard many cannot survive. The decision Lucas made in an alley, simple, immediate, and humane, had bought them time to stock a pantry, to count receipts, to enlist witnesses, and to call the sheriff when men came with designs. In the ledger of survival, it was as real as any miracle could be. They kept their house, they fed their children, they sat through nights of wind and woke to days when the sun had a crispness to it that tasted of new things. The law had been their ally when it mattered. The community had been a series of hands turned toward them when the storm pressed. And 2 people who chose each other had been the steady center of it all. On a winter evening some years after that first hard cold, Marian stood at the window as snow fell softly in the light of the lamplight. A child's laughter came from the kitchen and the steady sound of a loaf being sliced. She remembered the alley, the way the world had been narrowed to a single desperate choice, and she thought of the wagon's wheels turning away from that place. Lucas came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers like a habit of the heart. "You chose once," she said, not as a question but as a fact that had weight. "You could have kept going." "I didn't want to," he replied, and his voice had the plainness that had always steadied her. "I saw a thing that needed doing. We did it." They watched the snow together, a thin line of warmth between them. The house hummed with the small noises of a life saved from what the cold could do. It was a domestic miracle, unremarked in large papers, unclaimed by preachers, that had sprung from a decision. A cowboy who stopped in an alley, who offered a coat and the promise of a bed, and then followed that with the work of protection and the patience of law. If you believed in this rescue, subscribe and share so more people hear how a single choice saved lives. Outside, the snow feathered the world into white. Inside, a family ate and mended and told small stories, each a thread in the fabric of their survival. The tracks the wagon left in the snow had long been covered, but their shape remained in the things that mattered: a cord of wood, a sealed jar, a name on a ledger, and the steady warmth of people who had learned to stand for one another when the cold turned deadly.